Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and it's such an honor to be here at the Clinton School for Public Service. And as I mentioned yesterday, I am honored, privileged. I get to do this work and travel all over the country, even internationally, talking about sexual assault and victims' issues and trauma. And up until yesterday, so I have been to 47 states, and what's left are Alaska, North Dakota, and before yesterday, Arkansas. So I was so excited to have made it finally to Arkansas. So it's an honor and privilege. So thank you for coming to be part of this. So, sexual assault, not exactly a light lunchtime conversation that many of us, some of us have, but certainly not many of us have at our lunch hour. But it's been interesting because in this last year, and particularly in the last presidential campaign, sexual assault made its way to front and center news, right? More than we might have expected it to. And we found ourselves talking about rape, sexual assault, rape culture in places that we really didn't expect to see it, like, again, on headlines on the national news. So it was a mixed bag and a mixed blessing that occurred, because on one hand, it brought attention to the issue, and on the other hand, it just brought to light to all of us that there is still so much work to be done on this issue. So I thought I would start out by saying, given that I've been working in this field for I'm about 23 years, what I've seen and how I have seen us progress on this area of sexual assault and areas of work that I still think we need to do for our culture, for the safety of all of our people, and not just women, but men as well, as men are also victims of sexual violence that I think we often forget about, that this happens to boys and men as well. So for all of us to be safer. So let me just start by saying, let's start with the bad news, actually. Let's get the bad news over, is what we still have to do better on. To this day, many survivors of sexual assault, sexual violence, still do not come forward and seek help or make a report to law enforcement or other helping professionals because of feelings of worry or shame. And that's rooted in two big kind of themes. One is feeling like they're not going to be believed. That if they come forward, people's automatic response might be, well, is he making this up? Is he just trying to get revenge on someone else? Is she in it for the money? Right? Those are all popular beliefs. So if a victim feels like they are not going to be believed, either by a law enforcement professional, by a mental health professional, or by a family friend, right, or relative, it's effectively going to keep them in silence, right? So not being believed is huge, and unfortunately that still happens today. As soon as a victim comes out, stories are on nightly news, there's an attempt to discredit the victim in some way. And unfortunately, that strategy works. And then people are silenced. They're like, okay, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to go away and let this disappear. Well, that's devastating, because if that happens, not only, of course, is that person not going to get the help and support that he or she might need, but then there's no consequences for the people who perpetrate this crime. And what we know about people who commit sex offenses, all the research, all the data tells us that if they do it once, they're very likely to do it again. So when people don't come forward, if they're not believed, if they're forced back into silence, that means we have more sex offenders who very likely could reoffend. So first theme is that we're still not believing victims all the time. Second, not very popular or, attractive trend is that victims are still blamed for what is their perceived role in the sexual assault. And you might say, well, this is 2017. Surely we have progressed, right? That we're not making comments about, well, what was somebody wearing at that party? Or how much did that person drink, right? But unfortunately, having worked in this field, those are comments that are still made consistently, not only by the general public, by the media, but by some people who really count, which are jurors on these cases, that are still focusing more on what the victim did or didn't do to prevent the sexual assault than focusing on what the person did that committed the sexual assault. Does that make sense? So our focus, we put the focus on making the victim more culpable and the offender less culpable. And so until we shift that focus on, yes, so perhaps the victim who was sexually assaulted, let's say they were engaging in drinking alcohol. And let's say they were engaging in drinking a lot of alcohol. Let's say they were pretty intoxicated at a party with their friends, right? What we don't often look at is there is still an offender that capitalizes on that vulnerability to offend. So even if someone is intoxicated, it still takes a sexual offender to actually make an assault occur. And we'd much rather focus on how many drinks someone had or what they were doing or who they were dancing with before the party than actually somebody took advantage of someone else in a vulnerable situation to commit a crime. So these are fundamental kind of seedlings that fuel this culture of what we call rape culture. It allows sexual assault to live and be fueled and continue. And as long as we hold these beliefs about who's responsible or about believing or not believing someone when they come forward, we're not going to make inroads on this issue stopping. And unfortunately, I don't want to create too negative of a picture, but we haven't made a ton of progress here. Research is coming out all the time that studies among elementary school kids and high school age students that think that if someone was sexually assaulted and passed out, that if somebody assaults them, that's not rape because they were asleep or passed out. There's still that thinking that somehow that person that was passed out is at fault. So with beliefs like that, we're still behind the times of what we need to truly prevent this public health issue. I mean, Chelsea quoted the stat at the beginning. Just let's think about this for a second. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. Staggering numbers. It's an epidemic. And if we were here talking about 1 in 4 women in Arkansas or 1 in 6 men in Arkansas that had some type of disease or were infected with some kind of, virus that was going around in Arkansas, we would be throwing any kind of resource for education and prevention and intervention at this issue. But instead, the funds for prevention and education of this are drying up. So we stay behind the curve of what we need to truly affect change on this issue in particular. So now that I hope I don't have all of you depressed, but I mean it is sobering, right? It's sobering what we are dealing with, and how entrenched the attitudes and beliefs are that fuel sex assault. So it's not going to be easy to change. But let me tell you what is getting better. We're talking about it. I'm at the Clinton School of Public Service, right, talking about this. You're listening to me. Hopefully there's people streaming this, and it's getting to be a conversation that is happening. So that can only help. I want to share something just about my career that also says how we're getting better. We are doing a better job with our systems in terms of law enforcement's response to victims. This is generally speaking, is getting better. More effective prosecutions across the country, and more convictions for people who are actually convicted on these crimes. They're actually tried. They're actually getting convicted on sex assault crimes. So that's good. When I started my career, 1999, in the year 2000, I was endorsed by our district attorney to testify as an expert witness in the very first time they used an expert in a sex assault case in Boulder County, Colorado. So I was very young. I had no idea really what I was doing. I don't think the DA did either. I got on the stand, and it was a non-stranger sex assault. So in other words, the victim and the perpetrator knew each other. Most of the time in sex assault cases, that is the case. About 85% of the time, the victim and perpetrator know each other. So that whole idea of a stranger who jumps out of the bushes is really quite rare. It certainly happens. It's not the majority. So in this case where I was called to testify, the victim and perpetrator knew each other. It was a case where the victim was a high school student. She was invited to a big party on campus at the big university in Boulder, Colorado, and they proceeded to give this woman a lot of very strong, very good-tasting alcoholic beverage. It was kind of a punch with grain alcohol mixed in there. Now, I don't know. I haven't personally have drank that kind of thing in a long time, but I'm told it tastes good. It tastes like punch. You can rarely detect the alcohol. So the victim is given these shots, several, bordering on 7, 8, 9 shots, lots of this stuff. So as you can imagine, over time, she's getting more and more intoxicated. She passes out. They, meaning there was other people involved other than just the defendant who kind of facilitated this crime. They brought her up to a room. The people who participated in this, just to make sure, they took everything off of the walls, just to make sure that the victim wouldn't have any recollection of anything hanging on the wall that she could identify. So in other words, there wasn't a picture of Michael Jordan playing basketball or anything that she might say, oh yeah, there was a Jordan picture on the wall or whatever, right? It was a sterile room that they set up ahead of time to make sure that nobody could identify anything, just in case she woke up, just in case she remembered anything. A sex assault took place multiple times over the course of the evening. The woman eventually came to the next morning without her clothes, without anything on. She runs out of the house. I'll skip the details on the rest of it. She made an immediate report to law enforcement. That rarely happens. Rarely happens. Because why? Most of the time victims are afraid. They're afraid she is going to get blamed for what happened. Why were you drinking so much? Why'd you go to this party with all these guys you didn't know that well? Right? So to avoid that, usually victims want nothing to do with going to the police. So she actually makes an immediate outcry. They have amazing evidence, right? They had the offenders actually took the victim's clothes and put them up on their trophy stand in the house to say, you know, this was our conquest for the evening. She was also bruised. She had injury in her body that was consistent with being sexually assaulted after she underwent a sexual assault exam. I'll skip some of the other details. This case eventually gets to the DA's office. They move to prosecute the case. They call me in as an expert witness to talk about why might a victim go to a party like that? Why might the victim not have told her parents what happened? The victim didn't tell her parents. She called the police, but she didn't tell her parents. Well, I think we would know why they didn't tell it. Right? Shame, embarrassed, worried she would get in trouble with the parents. As it turned out, the victim, I think, told her parents initially she wasn't going to that party. She was going to a friend's party. So she was doing something wrong, right? So she was afraid maybe perhaps her parents would get mad at her. She'd get in trouble for that. So they put me on the stand as an expert witness, and I thought, okay, well, this should be a slam dunk case. They have great evidence. They had witnesses. They had injury. They had these people putting the trophies up on the mantle. This was the year 2000. They tried the case. I testified as an expert. Verdict came back, and they acquitted the defendant overwhelming and said that it was unclear if it was consensual. I don't know about you, but with consensual sexual activity, you usually don't leave your clothes on the mantle of where you were, or have a sexual activity in a room that's sterilized. But the jury acquitted overwhelmingly. And after the case, one of the jurors went actually down to the defendant, who was a very nice-looking college-age student, and actually had a very high-powered defense attorney from another state come in to defend him. And the juror apologized to the defendant by saying, "I'm so sorry this has been disruptive to your life." Meanwhile, the high school student is sitting there in the courtroom, alone, devastated, feeling like she wasn't believed, and the support and attention and care went to the defendant. So, not a good outcome, right? But what has changed is that was the year 2000. Now we're in 2017. Since then, I have testified in roughly 63, 65 criminal cases. Many of them very similar fact patterns as that case we just mentioned. Very similar. Victim and perpetrator know each other. Often alcohol is involved in these cases. Alcohol is usually involved in about 80% of sex assaults because offenders use alcohol to render the victim more helpless, more vulnerable, right? Think about that. It's much more easy if you were going to commit a robbery of somebody walking down the street. It's easier if you target the drunk person than the not drunk person if you want to get his wallet or her purse. Drunk people tend to be more vulnerable. So what we have found now since that event is we are getting, at least in Boulder County, Colorado, we are getting convictions on about 75% of the non-stranger sex assault cases because law enforcement is better at doing victim-centered interviews in a way where victims don't feel re-traumatized as frequently by the process. The DAs are putting together strong cases, And ultimately, I think because of our prevention efforts in the area, people are starting to put the focus on the offender, not on the victim, and are seeing the true dynamics of sex assault and don't buy in to the myths that we get fed in our media, right? The myths of it's only a stranger that does this kind of thing. It's men of color who assault white women. Complete myth. 90% of sex assaults are intra-racial, meaning of the same race. Okay? That weapons are used in sex assaults. You know, people are held at gunpoint or knife point. Not the case at all. 92% of cases, there's no weapon at all that's used. So we have been able to transcend some of those myths with appropriate education. And even 17 years, some of us in the movement are like, oh my gosh, we still have so far to go. But I've been able to see improvement. And we still have a ways to go, because every time there is a high-profile sex assault case and you see victim blaming and people in power or in leadership roles who still don't take responsibility and blame the victim, we go backwards. We see rates of reporting go down, right? Every time there's been a high-profile sex assault case and victims get mistreated in the press, we see calls to our hotline go down. We see calls to law enforcement go down. So we actually, all of us, have the ability to prevent sex assault by not endorsing myths, by believing victims, by not blaming victims, and focusing on offender behavior rather than assuming a person is doing this for money or attention or retribution. Because I estimate in my career I have worked with about 800 victims of sex assault myself. And I don't know any of those victims that would willingly, voluntarily put themselves through the process for an attention that might mean one day of headlines in the local paper. So, and most of these are criminal cases, not civil, so there's exactly $0 involved, right? Another myth that people want money or fame. So the hope is that collectively we will move together to end this epidemic crime. It needs all of us because it's entrenched. It's entrenched into our culture, right? As long as objectification and violence toward women and children and men is allowed to exist, this problem will exist, but we can continue to make a dent in it, right? One person at a time. So thank you. That's a lot. Any questions or comments? Yeah?
Come on, ask them. I've got one if somebody else, in fact, I got two, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone.
Do you have any statistics on what part pornography plays in the initiation of such deeds?
It's a great question, sir. So the role of pornography, I don't know if I have a statistic to quote per se, but we know that in the advent of the internet and the accessibility, the ease of accessibility of pornography on the internet, there's a huge correlation between that and the devaluation of women and a social expectation that this is what healthy sexual activity looks like, which, as we know, there's usually a big gap between healthy consensual sexual activity and what's typical sexual activity and pornography. But with so many people, in particular men, watching porn, they start to generalize that as, well, this is what women want. This is what women enjoy. This is what I'm entitled to with regard to sexual behavior. So it definitely plays into that rape culture piece. And the experts who talk about men's role in targeting men in prevention of sex assault will address the pornography issue head on, because it's underlying a huge cause of this. It's an excellent question. Thank you. Yeah.
Alex, got a question right here.
Thanks. Yeah, so going along with that, what are some other ways that we can fight back against rape culture and try to prevent, these assaults from ever happening?
Fighting back against rape culture. Okay, so that can happen in big and little ways. So first of all, it's really just beginning to not only not be part of, but being an active bystander against anything that is devaluing or offensive to women. So whether that's sexist jokes, right? Whether that's comments about somebody's appearance or what they think that they're wanting, or like over-sexualizing women, or seeing women for their sexual value or attractiveness and nothing else, okay? That sets up this idea that women are essentially there for men's enjoyment. I'm just going to put it bluntly, right? And until we say that's really not the primary goal of women to exist in this world right now, right? We have to challenge those beliefs, those actions, so that it's not a society of oppression, but one of true equal worth and value and respect. That's where we get at the heart at that. So that's one way. Another one that's a little bit more, assertive, is we actually take active bystander roles when we see a situation, right, that is not looking good. Like in that case I just told you, in that house, there were 9 men who lived in that house, who presumably saw what was going on. Now, research says that, based on research, at least 7 of those 9 guys were very uncomfortable with what was going on there. They saw what was going on and they didn't like it. That wasn't consistent with their value. But the problem was exactly 0 did anything about it. So we can't be complicit. Otherwise we're the co-conspirator. We're the unnamed co-conspirator in the room. When we look the other way or don't say, hey, that's not okay. Or take an effort to say, if a woman's intoxicated and she truly can't consent, to get her out of there and to get her home with someone safe to her, right? So I think it's to not, we do this thing where we get afraid to intervene, and we can look the other way and just be like, well, I don't want to get involved. That's not my business. But if we do that, then we're kind of silent conspirators to it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Mr. Trevino.
Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Andrew Trevino. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School, and I'm also a graduate of the University of Colorado Boulder. Although I'm happy to hear that the percentage of convictions are up in Boulder County, I was troubled with my time at the university with prevention education. Specifically during my freshman year, the only glimpse of education and prevention we got was focused on women and how to avoid being in those situations, and it never got down to men and preventing sexual assault and not committing sexual assault. So have you seen a trend in that changing, or do you see the need for that to change, to shift our focus on women to men?
Fantastic question. And I absolutely this must shift, right? For years, and unfortunately, in some cases now, we did what I call rape avoidance education, which is telling women what to do to not get raped, right? So carry a whistle. Don't walk at night. Walk with a friend. That is not rape prevention. That is rape avoidance. That is not systemic. We need to hit this at the root of the problem, which ultimately is men's violence against women. So rather than don't get raped, we need to be giving the message to men and boys, don't rape. This is what respect is. This is healthy sexuality. This is consent. How do you know if you have consent? It's not on the woman to define what the boundaries are sexually. That's a mutual decision that both partners need to be engaged in, right? And so I think if we as a movement have not gone beyond rape avoidance, we have failed. And we need to start targeting it systematically, targeting boys and men, and frankly, boys young boys, middle school, even elementary school age, right? And that's how we'll stop this problem. Eve Ensler, who wrote the book, The Vagina Monologues, I don't know if she's a playwright, a poet, she has a quote that says, when men begin to take a stand against sexual violence, the world will change. So that's what we need to promote.
We have a question right here.
One of the things that was surprising to me was that sexual assault is not about sex, and that it was more of a power thing. And I'd like to ask you a very basic question, which is, what is rape?
So it's a great question. And yes, while sexual assault is fueled with issues around power and control and entitlement, I take a little different stance than is usually taught by some people in the movement, and say, actually, sex assault is about sex too, because it's about somebody trying to get sexual gratification. So that's about sex. So it's motivated by sexual gratification with also these other pieces of power, control, and entitlement to that. So no matter if someone else is willing or consenting or wants it equally, I'm going to get what I want, and what I'm going to get is sex. So sex is in the picture of this, because if we take it out, then we're talking about other kinds of assault, and we're talking about sexual assault here. Great question.
Okay, of the 800 cases that you've worked with, how many roughly college-age students of that number?
Well, that's a great question. So keep in mind, I live where I've practiced predominantly is in a college town. Sure. But given that, I'd probably say about between 55 and 60%. So maybe not as high as some people would think. Some people might think it was higher, that this is more an issue about college-age people. We've certainly had a fair amount of high school age, and all the way up through the lifespan. And as a matter of fact, some of the most recent cases that are coming to mind, we've had a couple older adults, and we've had a couple professional people in their 40s who are also kind of coming forward on this. So it really comes across the lifespan.
Yes, question right here.
The research that I read indicates that your statistics about about 25% of women, females, are assaulted in their lifetime, and about 70% of men. It seems to me that that's really, really light. And the problem is underreported in the social psychological research that I've read. And the willingness to come forward, I mean, even on a side note, I like to know that it's even happening here because most of the questions are guys. But I know we all have a lot of questions, but the statistics show quite a few of us in here experience this. Is that not going? Okay, great. But anyway, I would like to get your perspective on what you think the actual percentage is, and also, as a second question, your opinion on what's going on in places where sexual assault is now being codified into law.
Okay, let me answer the first question first. Right, I quoted statistics, and those are based on reported sex assaults, right? And I think it is dramatically underreported. Some of it is how we ask the question. If we say, have you ever been sexually assaulted, sometimes people don't even know what that means or what constitutes a sex assault. So, for example, like there's other ways of sexually assaulting someone and touching or inserting things in private parts, areas covered by the bathing suit, okay? So it doesn't have to just look one way that we think it might look. So if we ask this question in a broader way, like this, if we ask the question, has anybody ever done anything to you sexually that made you uncomfortable? I think, in my experience, we would probably start hitting in the 90 percentile of women, and I think perhaps in the 50 to 60% range with men. So it's how we ask the question, which leads to the underreporting. Yep. And then, forgive me, I'm sorry, the second part.
Russia just passed a law that says it's okay to abuse your wife.
Oh, right.
And there are other countries where it's codified, and the ability to assault someone sexually is codified into law. So I was wondering, I'm seeing ominous signs of that happening in the United States too, and so I was going to get your perspective on that.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not going to. I'm not going to be fearful to say we're going that far backwards. But I have seen places all across the country where some of the more aggressive efforts to get on top of this crime are getting a little more watered down. So, for instance, more lenient standards on sex offender treatment and management. In Colorado, I'll use my state. At one point, I think at one point, this is anecdotal, but I think we had one of the strongest sex offender management programs in the whole country. And over the years, the defense bar has watered that down little by little, so now you have more sex offenders that are getting out and not managed as actively. So we're not going all the way to say sex assault is legal or not a crime, but there's certain systemic things where there's been a little bit of a backslide. So that's why victim advocacy groups, right, like your Arkansas Coalition or work that I do, need to keep the pressure on. Because otherwise, the epidemic will get worse. Yep.
Josh, got a question back there.
Hi. Thank you again for coming out this afternoon. My name is Josh Snyder. I'm also a first-year student here at the Clinton School. Unfortunately, I did not go to Boulder, Colorado. But my question pertains to something that you said earlier about education, especially how we should educate our youth in terms of this. It seems to me that just for a good long while now, moral education of any sort has been a very contentious subject, and nobody can seem to agree on where that moral education should take place, and as a result, it just generally doesn't happen. Do you have any recommendations for overcoming that, especially in terms of educating the youth, as you suggested here?
Well, okay. So here's a radical idea. Parents, I'm being serious. Like, I think we look to, well, shouldn't they get this in schools? Shouldn't they get this as part of this curriculum? My answer I'd love to say yes and absolutely, right? But what we have found, I can speak, is that particularly funding, federal funding, and I would imagine this would continue to worsen, federal funding, state funding, they're taking funds away from prevention, right? Not just sex abuse and all kinds of prevention. Prevention funding is going down. More money's being put into intervention, which drives us crazy because, right? Let's stop this from happening so we don't have more people, right? But anyway, so as prevention funding goes down, what this calls for is education that has to come, frankly, from our families, parents, about what is consent? What is appropriate treatment of women? What is okay? What part of your body is okay to touch? Who can touch it? What's good touch? What's bad touch? And as prevention efforts get cut, we need that to be happening in families. And what I have found is that people are afraid to have these conversations. They don't know how to have those conversations, right? But resources are out there all over the place, free on the internet, about how to talk to your boys about getting consent. What's good touch and bad touch? And if somebody doesn't touch you in a way, who do you tell, right? It's out there. So unfortunately, I don't think we can look to our states or to the federal government, at least not right now, to be spearheading prevention efforts here. So we have to do it ourselves. We have to get empowered.
Okay, I know there are more questions, and we're going to have time to do that after the program. But let's thank her for a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
And I want to thank the Arkansas Coalition for always bringing great speakers to us and for bringing this topic. I'll tell you, this is a topic that we are glad in the sense of awareness to showcase every year, and we applaud what you all do. And every day you work hard. So thank you very much. Thank you all for